Let me begin with my story. I don't want to dwell on it, but that is the catalyst which led me to write the book. That was 37 years ago on a beautiful, sunny Southern California Sunday morning. Every once in a while you have those days that just work. And it was 10 days before Pesach. I was the director of the Hebrew Academy. My then wife, Oleha Shalom, was a teacher at the Hebrew Academy. And we had 11 children from the age of 14 all the way down to 16-month-old twins. 10 days before Pesach, that's when the pre-Pesach anxiety sets in. And Pesach is coming, ready or not. And Hebrew academies throughout America often have a pre-Pesach program where the children can invite their parents to show off what they've learned about Pesach, from Anishtana to the songs. And that goes on for 2 hours, kindergarten through grade 4. My wife, besides being a teacher and besides having with 11 kids, the oldest being 14, between K and 4 you have to have a bunch of kids performing. And she also played piano, so she was the musical accompanist for the presentation. And things were good. I, on the other hand, went to Los Angeles, where I gave a class every Sunday morning to the yeshiva bachrim. My wife actually mentioned to a friend of hers then, I wasn't there, and the friend told it to me a few weeks later, that she felt very not well, but she has to stick it out because she has to perform and take the kids home, and she did. As I was coming back from LA to Long Beach, which is where we lived, I got a call from her saying, Gershon, I'm not feeling well at all. I need to see a doctor. Come quick. I came as quick as I can, got into the house, saw her, and realized this was not a trivial matter. Rushed her to the closest hospital, which was about 2 miles from our home, took her straight into the emergency room, and I was told, stay in the waiting room. I did what I needed to do. I called the Rebbe's office, asked Rabbi Klein, the Rebbe's secretary, who happened to be my brother-in-law, to please go into the Rebbe and alert him immediately that my wife is not well, and it seems more serious than a little thing. And he said, I'll do that. I took out my Tillim. I sat Tillim for a while. And in about 45 minutes, the doctor came out. His face was somber. He looked me in the eyes and said, Rabbi, we did everything we could, but your wife passed away. I recall vividly the thoughts that went through my mind then. The first thought was, life as I knew it up until this moment has changed forever. All the goals, all the dreams, all the plans, they're going to have to be revised. But the second thought that I had right after that was, this is not a fluke. This is not a chance occurrence. This is part of a plan. Why? I have no idea. I can say today, 37 years later, I still have no idea, but we can discuss that in the questions and answers. But this is a plan from God. And now my challenge is to see if I can put everything that I believed in, everything that I've taught and everything that I've preached, can I put it into action? And I asked myself, am I up for it? And I didn't know at that point what the answer would be. Fast forward, the next few weeks were a flurry of activity, as you can only imagine, from planning a funeral to sitting Shiva to preparing for Pesach and running a school. My job running the school as the director, it's a nice fancy term, but it means you need to make sure that the checks that go out every month are covered. That means a lot of fundraising. That doesn't stop because of my personal circumstances, and I did my best to keep it going. For myself, in terms of conceptually, I grew up as a frum Orthodox Jew. I went through yeshiva, I got smicha. I knew the sources, I knew the answers. I was 38 years old, my wife was then 36. I have done my funerals, I have done my shiva visits, I have spoken and counseled many people. I had the answers. But now I had to try them on for size, and that is something completely different. I sought for myself to find things that speak to my heart, not just to my mind. I looked for Jewish literature on the subject. There were some scholarly articles, but they're more for the mind, not for the heart. Today, there's a half a dozen good English books. In 1986, there were none. It was a rough time. I felt very imbalanced. When half of yourself is amputated, how could you feel balanced? I sought and found a therapist who fit my criteria, a person who themselves lost a spouse and raised children themselves. And I found a retired Jewish psychologist from Los Angeles who I went to every 2 weeks, spent an hour with her, taped the sessions, listened to them for the next 2 weeks until the next session. I did that for 6 months and found out that feeling imbalanced, which I saw as not normal, is the new normal. Get used to it. You have to adjust to a new normal. That was 37 years ago. I will say that with God's help and Hashgacha Pratis, I did remarry less than 2 years later. My wife, Chana Rachel, who's been with me for 36 years. And it would be dishonest if I said that she helped me raise the children. More honest would be I helped her raise our children. She's a better mother than I will ever be. Anyway, life went on, and as newlyweds, who normally have a certain period of time where they can adjust to each other before the family grows, but she went from Yerushalayim into the frying pan of Long Beach, California, and suddenly had 11 children. Not a lot of time for private discussions where couples integrate with each other. And after a few years, we said, we need to take some time for ourselves. It's only fair. And we did. We planned a 2-week period in Eretz Yisrael, farmed out the kids, whoever would take them. Take them, thank you. And we went to Eretz Yisrael and relaxed and breathed deeply, looked in each other's eyes and spoke to each other. And as we're walking around on a little square, just off the parking lot, there's a Rothschild's house, which is now a yeshiva, but it was a house that the Rothschilds it was some kind of a charitable house. It's a quiet area, and my wife was talking to me at 11 o'clock in the morning, and she says, "Gershon, how are you?" I thought that interesting. We've been up together for the last 3 or 4 hours. Now she asks me, "How are you?" And I said, "Baruch Hashem, fine." That was not the end of the discussion. She asked me again, "Gershon, how are you really?" That really pierced my heart. I became dizzy, I became pale, and if you've ever heard the expression, one's life flashed before him in an instant, well, I can't say my entire life flashed before me, but the events from the day my first wife, Alaa Shalom, passed until this moment in this quiet place in Yerushalayim flashed by in one instant, and I knew whatever I am experiencing is related to this period of my life. And I knew I needed help, and I knew I couldn't deal with it myself. Fortunately, we had a friend or an acquaintance who was a therapist who used to live in Westwood, California, moved to Yerushalayim, had a private practice. And we called her, found out she could make time for us, and for the next 10 days that we remained in Yerushalayim, I commandeered 2 hours of her day every second day to try to figure out what was going on. And it took a while. She asked a lot of wise and questions to tweak out the issues. And I found out, to my own surprise, I thought life had returned to normal. I'm running the Hebrew Academy. The family is functioning for better and for worse. We kept moving forward. I'm happily married. What can be wrong? I found out that I have a serious grudge against Hashem. Now, I'm an Orthodox Jew, I'm a rabbi, I'm a Chabad rabbi. How can I have a grudge against Hashem? That doesn't make any sense. So I denied it for a few years until that really pierced my shell and I couldn't deny it anymore. Now, I'm not a therapist, but I will say there are certain things that if you suppress, they just build up pressure. Once the pressure is removed, and once you identify what the issue is, and you bring in some light and fresh air, whatever has been building up there dissipates. It took a few months, maybe a year or two, for the remaining grudge to work its way through, and Baruch Hashem, life returned to normal. So, what I learned from this is that knowing something in one's mind doesn't necessarily impact one's heart, because the heart can have a mind of its own. And my heart wasn't very happy with the circumstances. My mind was accepting of it, but my heart was not happy with it. But now we were on a better track. So when people ask me, why did I write the book? The answer is, when I wanted to find a book like mine, it was not available. I paid a heavy price to get the education, and I said to myself then, I'll interject, there was another book called Why Bad Things Happen to, or When Bad Things Happen to Good People, by a Rabbi Harold Kushner, a conservative rabbi who also went through a serious tragedy with his son, who was born, and at the age of 3 was diagnosed with a rare illness called pregoria, which is early onset aging, and he was told your child will not make it through adolescence. He actually passed away a few days after his 14th birthday. And needless to say, the parents lived through a living hell for the next 11 years. And he wrote a book about tragedy and where God fits into tragedy. Unfortunately, his thesis was that God is not in charge of all bad things that happen in the world. There are pockets of evil that are outside of God's purview. When I read that book, before my wife had passed away, I found it strange that people will find it comforting. I'd rather have a God who's in charge that I don't understand than there's no one in charge. It's nihilistic. It's just a free-for-all. And I said, someone ought to write a book addressing the subject from a traditional Jewish perspective. And I waited and waited. For well over 30 years, nobody wrote that book. So I figured I might as well write it myself. And I waited and waited again until I realized Imle Achshav Amosai, if not now, when? So I wrote the book, and thank God the book was published. It was not easy work, but it came out. And it has gotten, Baruch Hashem, good reviews, and it's more important than the reviews. I have many stories of people who are in the process of going through a tragedy shortly after, where the book has given them support, emotional support, religious support. I am proud and happy and humbled to say it works. It has a message, and the message works. We all want answers. And there are schools of thought in religious thought or in religious culture, mitar nicht fragen. You're not allowed to ask questions on God. If that worked in Europe, I don't know, but in America, with the openness that we live in today, that does not work. Because if you don't ask the questions, you'll find it somewhere else, or you'll go crazy. We have no problem with asking questions. We have no problem in our religion of challenging God. I'll give you a very short list of prophets who challenged God. Avraham Avinu, Abraham, first Jew. Hashefet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh. Mishpat, should the judge of the entire world not do justice? Moshe Rabbeinu, the first leader who brought down the Ten Commandments from Mount Sinai. He said to God, Lama harayesta lama, why did you do bad to this nation? If anybody has said any Tillim, any time with some understanding of the words of Tillim, David HaMelech is constantly complaining to God, why are these things happening to us? And it is King David's words that we use, they're incorporated in the davening, and when we say Tillim, we are channeling David HaMelech's words for our misery, for our tsaras, and for our tragedies. Yirmiyah, who prophesied about the destruction of the temple, he complains, why do the wicked prosper and why do the righteous suffer? And then there's a whole book by the name of Eov, the book of Job, which talks about one individual sufferer, and it's a book of over 40 chapters where God plays a role in the beginning and in the end, and his friends who come visit him argue with him and say, if you're suffering, it's because you're a sinner, because God is right. If you're suffering, it must be you deserve it. And God, at the end, when he does make his appearance, rebukes his friends and said, you better ask Eov to pray for you, or else I'm going to do something to you. because you have no right to judge others to defend my honor, God's honor. So now these were prophets, these were Nevi'im. They had a direct line to God, and they challenged God. Nobody said that they did anything wrong. In fact, we need to realize they challenged God out of their intense faith in Hashem. In effect, they said to God, God, we know you. We know you're in charge. We know you're kind. And we know you're good. Why is this happening? It doesn't seem consistent. We trust what's happening is correct, but give us some understanding of how this could be possible. How do we reconcile the two? So questioning God, not as a rebel, but as an act of faith, is quite appropriate. And we have a lot of good precedent for that. I have a niece who lives in Hanover, Germany. She and her husband were shluchim, first in Odessa, and after 5 years in Odessa, they opened up shop for themselves in Hanover, where there was very little Yiddishkeit happening. They opened a Chabad house, and for 8 years, they worked tirelessly, day and night. Both he and his wife are dynamic people, didn't know what sleep means, and they worked hard and built up a community which now has a shul and a bar mitzvah classes and a Talmud Torah and a preschool and adult education, and they put on tefillin with people. They have another project which we don't do that much publicly in America, but it works well in Hanover, Germany, for Russian immigrants who didn't have much education. They do brisson on children and adults, because many of the people who are there, whether they're 8 or sometimes 80, never had a bris, and they come forward, remember this word, voluntarily. And then it must have been, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, when COVID started. Benny, my sister's son, came down with COVID. He was in the hospital for the first 2 nights of Pesach, fell into a coma, and 2.5 weeks later passed away. And Sterny, his wife, who has nerves of titanium, said, "Oh, I'm not leaving." She was raised in Eretz Yisrael. She has parents. She has brothers and sisters. "I'm staying. I'm going to keep this position going. We committed to it, Benny and I will keep it going." And she is there for the next, this is, I think, 4 years later. Benny's passing, sadly, brought about a groundswell of support, and money was raised to put up a building in Benny's honor. So they have, it's tough, but she keeps it going. She was interviewed by Ami magazine, and the interviewer asked a lot of piercing questions. One of the questions was, "Do you have any questions on God?" And she said, "Wouldn't you?" And then she paused and said, "Yes, I have many questions on God, but I don't have any doubts." And that, in a nutshell, sums up the Jewish attitude. We can have questions. We don't have to deny them. We don't have to suppress them. We can talk them out with friends, with rabbis, talk to God directly. But having questions doesn't equate having doubts. There are many answers for tsaros, for small problems, for manageable problems, but when it comes to tragedy, the only answer is that God is a different existence, and he is not that we don't understand him, he is inherently not knowable. He is the creator. He's not a creature, he's the creator that created the universe, time, space, values, everything that we live in the bubble that we live in called the universe. God created it. He is outside of it. How could a little creature inside, a tiny little creature inside this bubble understand the creator? He wants us to understand him, contorted himself into our environment, gave us a Torah and mitzvahs that give us understanding of certain aspects of God that we can understand. But at the end, where our understanding of God ends, trust that God is the all-powerful one, even though we can't understand him. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says the question that we need to ask is not why, but what. What are we supposed to do now? What can we do to ameliorate the problem going forward for the people who are going through the tragedy? Do they need a hug? Do they need financial support? Do they need emotional support? For the world, what can we do to eliminate that illness or that circumstance so that it doesn't happen again? That's where we fit in. That's where we become partners with God in creation. So the atheist has no answers, and the religious person, at the end of the day, also doesn't have answers. What's the difference? There's a difference of day and night. If you don't have a God who's in charge, then you are a victim of chance. Victimhood is trending in the last few years. You can do a lot of good things with victimhood. You can be proud of it. You can monetize it. And at the end of the day, you're a rich, proud victim. Or you can say, I'm not a victim. God gives me agency of how, he makes me the one in charge of how I will interpret the events that happen to me. And there is a moment where we get to choose. Viktor Frankl speaks about that a lot. At a time, historically, we were exiled from Eretz, from the second Beis Hamikdash, almost 2,000 years ago. We're not victims. We're still around. God is still keeping an eye out for us, and we daven to Hashem, we ask for Mashiach, and meanwhile, we keep building the future Beis Hamikdash through our deeds and through our communal efforts and through our personal mitzvahs. I think being part of a community is awesomely important in life in general, especially when you find yourself in need of support. There's a verse in Mishlei, in Proverbs, B'chol eit ahov horeya v'och l'tzara yivoled. At all times, love a friend, and a brother will blossom, will be born in a time of tzara. We are not alone. We are not isolated. It's sad when a person has no one to turn to. That's all the laws of Shiva. People come to support, and people look around to identify what the family needs, what the individual needs, and they support them. We are a community. We are a family. If you meet another Jew at an airport, or as I once met a Jew on top of some volcano in Kauai, the minute the person identified himself as a Jew, all of a sudden we have a connection. I got to tell you a funny story. I was once staying at the timeshare at this hotel, and I walked 5 miles to the Chabad shul by Rabbi Posner. It's a 5-mile walk each way. It's hot.
So hot.
Huh?
I said, I hope it wasn't as hot as this.
Well, on the way to shul it wasn't, but on the way back it was. Anyway, I'm walking along one of these streets that go up, and there's a car whizzes by, makes a short stop, puts his car in reverse. I don't know how you can drive 200 feet at 50 miles an hour going backwards, and he stops right where I am, and he jumps out of the car, and I said, uh-oh, this is not good. And the guy yells out at the top of his lungs, pointing at me, "These are my people!" Gets back into the car and runs away. Yes, community is very, very important in good times and especially in bad. You know, faith in God means that Hashem is in charge and everything that happens to us is for a purpose, even when we cannot articulate the purpose. Sometimes things make sense in retrospect, and little by little things look different in hindsight than in foresight. But we believed and believe, every single one of us and the children, including the children, that this is part of a divine plan. I will just add just a philosophical point. We view something like this: my wife died. All 12 of us, the husband and the 11 children, are collateral damage of my wife's passing. That is an incorrect view. From Judaism's perspective, my wife passed away for whatever reasons that made sense to God, and the impact on each one of us and on her parents, her mother, her siblings, her students, the parent body of the Hebrew Academy were all profoundly impacted by her sudden passing. They were not all collateral damage and victims. That was all, each one of them were challenged in a different way. This is biblical, the sources, that that God does not do collateral damage. This is something that in the scientific mind, it's not rational, but from the religious perspective, God is in charge of everything, even things that seem connected, but each one is individually and purposely for each one. The question is there an equivalence between the Holocaust, in which 6 million people died, I think a third of them children, and one single child dying at the age of 5, or is there an equivalence, or is there a difference? I'll give you a simple answer and a more complicated answer. The simple answer is, for the parent that lost the child at the age of 5, this is their Holocaust. The philosophical answer is, and if you give me your name and email address later, I will cite the source. There's a sefer called Sha'ar HaGemul from the Ramban, and he explicitly addresses this question, and he says, from a human perspective, 2 is twice as much as 1, and 6 million is 6 million times 1. From the perspective of God's truth and God's justice, 1 in 6 million are identical. And either way, you need emunah and belief in God, the transcendent, to come to terms with it. Thank you very much for listening.